I didn't find a lipstick stain or a receipt for a hotel room. I found a floor plan. It was tucked behind the drawer of Silas's desk, a blue-lined map of a room that shouldn't exist, located directly beneath our master bedroom. My husband, the man who spent 15 years building skyscrapers and kissing me goodbye every morning, hadn't been working late at the firm. He'd been digging. The betrayal wasn't in his heart. It was in the foundation of our home. As I stared at the ventilation specs for a soundproofed observation suite, the air in the room turned to ice. He wasn't just hiding a secret, he was building a cage, and the realization that I had been sleeping inches above his darkness made my skin crawl with a nausea no apology could ever fix. I felt a hollow, aching void where my trust used to live, a physical weight in my chest that made every breath feel like inhaling glass. The drive felt like a funeral procession for a life I hadn't realized was already dead. Silas had left at 2 p.m., his usual Saturday routine. "Just checking the foundation on the Miller project," he'd said, his voice as smooth as the silk tie I'd bought him for Christmas. I watched the garage door slide down, its mechanical hum sounding like a closing tomb. I waited, counting the seconds, my grip on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned a ghostly white. When I finally pulled out of the driveway, the neighborhood looked different. The manicured lawns and cheerful flower beds felt like a theatrical set designed to distract from the rot underneath. I followed him at a distance, keeping 3 or 4 cars between us. He didn't head toward the upscale suburbs or the glittering downtown office. Instead, he steered his silver sedan south, crossing the bridge into the industrial district. This was a place of rusted, corrugated metal, flickering streetlights, and the skeletal remains of old factories that the city had forgotten decades ago. My stomach churned with every turn he took. This wasn't where architects spent their afternoons. This was where secrets went to be buried, far from the prying eyes of society. He pulled up to a massive, windowless warehouse on the edge of the river, a monolithic slab of gray concrete that seemed to swallow the gray afternoon light. I watched from a block away, slumped low in my seat, as he used a keypad to enter a side door. He didn't look around. He didn't look like a man doing something wrong. He looked like a man going to work. That was the most terrifying part, the normalcy of his movements. I sat there for an hour, the silence of the car amplified by the roar of my own pulse. My mind was a whirlwind of dark possibilities. Was he meeting someone? Was he selling stolen blueprints? Or was it exactly what that hidden floor plan suggested? The internal monologue in my head wouldn't stop. "Go home, Elena. Just turn the car around and pretend you never saw the map. Go back to the bakery, bake some bread, and let the lie keep you warm." But I couldn't. The curiosity was a sickness, a fever that demanded to be broken. I needed to know if the man I shared a bed with was a person or a monster. I stepped out of the car, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. The smell of the river, rot and salt, was overwhelming. I approached the warehouse, my footsteps echoing on the cracked asphalt like a countdown. To my surprise, the heavy steel door hadn't fully latched. It was a mistake, a rare, infinitesimal lapse in Silas's perfectionism. I slipped inside, the air immediately turning cold and smelling of damped concrete, ozone, and something sharp like industrial cleaner. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows, illuminated only by the occasional work lamp hanging from the vaulted ceiling. I followed the sound of a low, rhythmic thudding coming from the very back of the structure, moving from shadow to shadow, my heart a trapped bird in my ribcage. The deeper I went, the more the warehouse changed. It wasn't a storage space, it was a construction site. The walls were reinforced with thick, sound-dampening foam, and the floor was cut away in sections, revealing deep, reinforced concrete pits. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't just building one room, he was building a subterranean complex. I reached a stack of wooden crates and peered around them, my breath hitching in my throat. The back of the warehouse had been transformed into a high-tech laboratory that looked like something out of a dystopian film. Glass partitions divided the space into sterile, brightly lit cells. Inside them were rows of server racks, their cooling fans providing the low thudding sound I'd heard. Silas was there, but he wasn't alone. He was standing with two men in lab coats, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of several monitors. They weren't talking about love or affairs. They were looking at complex architectural renderings that didn't look like buildings. They looked like habitats for something or someone. The structural integrity of the subterranean levels is holding, Silas said, his voice echoing in the vast space. He sounded different here, authoritative, cold, and obsessive, but the acoustic dampening isn't sufficient. If they scream, the vibration will register on the surface sensors. I told you, this has to be a vacuum. Total isolation. I want the subjects to feel like they are at the bottom of the ocean. I felt the blood drain from my face. If they scream, my husband was talking about soundproofing a prison. I looked closer at the monitors. The rendering showed a massive underground complex designed with the precision of a master architect, but the intent of a predator. It was located directly beneath our own property, the woods behind our house that he insisted on buying last year under the guise of privacy for our future children. He'd been building a nightmare right under my feet while I slept, using the money from our joint savings to fund his obsession. I saw a ledger on a nearby table, a thick, leather-bound book that looked out of place among the high-tech equipment. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for a reality check, pushed me forward. I crept toward it while Silas was distracted by a data readout. I flipped it open, my hands shaking so hard the pages rattled. It wasn't a list of mistresses, it was a list of names. Names of people who had gone missing in the tri-state area over the last 2 years. Next to each name was a series of numbers, dates, times, and retention status. What broke me wasn't just the names, it was the marginalia. In the blank spaces of the ledger, Silas had doodled little reminders for our life together. Next to the description of a woman's psychological breakdown in cell 4, he had written, "Pick up Elena's favorite peonies for Tuesday." The two worlds were intertwined in his mind, the domestic and the monstrous, sharing the same ink. I felt a violent surge of bile rise in my throat. Every kiss he'd given me, every "I love you" whispered before sleep, had been punctuated by the data of a stranger's agony. He wasn't living a double life. He was living one single, cohesive life, where I was merely the wallpaper of a torture chamber. I realized with a jarring, sick clarity that I was the only person in the world who could look at his handwriting and see the grocery lists and the death warrants simultaneously. He hadn't just stolen our savings, he had stolen the sanctity of my memories, retroactively poisoning every happy moment we'd shared for a decade. I wasn't just a wife, I was the alibi he wore to work every day. The names were familiar. A college student from the next town over, a delivery driver who had vanished on his route, a woman who had been seen last at the park near our house. Underneath the names were notes in Silas's handwriting, meticulous observations about their durability and psychological response to sensory deprivation. He wasn't just building a prison, he was conducting experiments. He was an architect of human suffering, using his skills to see how much a person could take before they broke. I stood there, paralyzed, the ledger heavy in my hands. The man I had loved for 15 years, the man who had comforted me when my mother died, was a monster hiding in plain sight. He had built a life with me as a camouflage, a way to appear normal, while he indulged in a darkness so profound I couldn't even fathom it. The internal monologue in my head was screaming now, "Run, run, and never look back!" But my feet wouldn't move. I was anchored to the floor by the sheer weight of the betrayal. I looked at Silas, really looked at him, and saw the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about total isolation. It was the look of a man who had finally found his true calling. The ledger fell from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The sound was like a gunshot in the sterile environment. Silas spun around, his eyes narrowing as they landed on me. For a fraction of a second, I saw the man I loved, the confusion, the instinct to protect. But it vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, blank stare. It was the look of a man who had already justified his sins to himself, a man who viewed other people as nothing more than building materials. "Elena," he said softly, walking toward the glass partition, "you shouldn't have followed me. I did everything I could to keep this away from you. I wanted to protect your innocence." "What is this, Silas?" I screamed, the tears finally breaking through. "The names, the rooms, the retention status? What have you done? Who are these people?" "I'm an architect, Elena," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I've spent my life building things that fall apart, buildings that people grow old and die in. I wanted to build something that lasts, something that tests the limits of the human spirit. The world is chaotic, cruel, and messy. I'm creating a controlled environment, a place where variables can be eliminated, where we can see what a human being really is when you strip away the world." He wasn't cheating on me. He was a predator who had built a private, high-tech dungeon to study the breaking points of human beings. He had used our life, our assets, and his talent to construct a hell that no one could find. I looked at the lab coats. They weren't doctors. They were engineers paid to turn his sick vision into reality. My husband was the architect of a private holocaust, and I had been his unwitting financier. "You're insane," I whispered, backing away, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. "I'm going to the police. I'm calling everyone. You'll never get away with this." Silas didn't run. He didn't even look worried. He just looked at his watch, a gold piece I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. "The police won't find anything here, Elena. This is just a shell company. And as for the woods, you signed the permits yourself. You trusted me with the signatures for the landscaping and drainage project. Your name is on every piece of paper that funded this. If I go down, you go down as an accomplice." He stepped out from behind the glass, his shadow stretching long and dark across the concrete floor. He wasn't going to let me leave. I was no longer his wife. I was a variable that needed to be controlled. The room felt like it was closing in, the sound of the cooling fans rising to a deafening roar in my ears. I looked at my husband, the man I had shared 1,000 meals with, and realized that I had never truly known him. The sick secret wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a fundamental rot in his soul that he had meticulously hidden behind a picket fence and a wedding ring. He had built our entire relationship as a foundation for his darkness. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt, not for what he'd done, but for my own blindness. I had been his accomplice in the most literal sense, providing the domestic bliss that shielded him from scrutiny. But Silas had made one mistake. He assumed that because I loved him, I was weak. He assumed that because he had manipulated the paperwork, I was his pawn. He forgot that to run a successful bakery for 10 years, you have to be meticulous. You have to notice the small things, the missing scents, the slight changes in the flour, the patterns of the people who come through the door. I knew every deviation in his schedule, even if I'd chosen to ignore them until now. "I didn't just sign permits, Silas," I said, my voice steadying as a cold, hard resolve took over. I stopped backing away and stood my ground, my eyes locked on his. "I'm the one who handles the bakery's taxes. I'm the one who noticed the equipment purchases from the subsidiary accounts months ago. I didn't know what they were for, so I did what any scared wife would do. I didn't go to the police. I went to a private investigator." The calm on Silas's face flickered. Just for a second, I saw a crack in the facade. "The burner phone?" I continued, stepping closer to him, ignoring the men in lab coats. "I didn't need to open it. I just needed to clone it. Every text, every coordinate, every retention status update has been uploading to a secure cloud drive for the last week. My PI has instructions to release it to the feds if I don't check in by 4 p.m. It's 3:55, Silas. You're an architect, but you forgot about the most important part of any structure, the redundancy. You built a fortress, but you left the back door open to the one person who knows your passcodes. The silence that followed was absolute. The architect had met a structural flaw he couldn't design his way out of, my own survival instinct. He had spent years building a prison, but he forgot that he shared his life with someone who knew his every habit, his every pattern. I wasn't just his wife, I was his shadow, and the shadow had finally learned how to bite back. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to find a workaround, a way to silence the cloud drive or find the PI, but time was a resource he no longer controlled. "Let me go," I said, my voice a low, dangerous whisper, "and maybe I'll give you a 5-minute head start before the sirens get here. Not for you, not for the monster you are, but for the memory of the man I thought I married. I want you to run, Silas. I want you to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, knowing that the one person who truly knew you was the one who tore your world down." Silas looked at me, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw true fear in his eyes. Not fear of the law, but fear of the fact that he had lost control of his own narrative. He signaled to the men in the lab coats. They stepped aside, their faces pale. I walked out of that warehouse and never looked back. I didn't go home to the house with the secret basement. I went straight to the precinct. The resolution wasn't clean. Silas disappeared before the FBI could raid the warehouse, becoming a ghost in the very industrial sprawl he'd tried to master. I lost everything: the house, the bakery, the money, and my sense of safety. The woods behind our home were excavated, revealing a horror that made national headlines for weeks. I had to move to a different state, change my name, and start over. I spent nights lying awake in unfamiliar rooms, listening for the sound of someone digging beneath me. But as I sat in a small apartment months later, listening to the rain against the window, I realized I'd gained something far more valuable than a picket fence and a lie. I was no longer a victim of a masterpiece. I was the one who had dismantled it. The floorboards in my new home didn't echo, because there was nothing left underneath them to hide. I had looked into the abyss and survived, and though the pain was a permanent resident in my heart, the truth had finally set me free. Silas was an architect of cages, but I was the one who held the key to my own life. I was finally breathing air that wasn't heavy with his secrets.